So arguably, there are two research themes that have most occupied me over the last 10 years. I've been interested in a number of different things, but they're really two themes that really have occupied me primarily over the last 10 years. One of them is mind wandering. This has been absolutely a central interest of mine. And the second one is meta-awareness, which is our awareness of our current mental state, and particularly our awareness of mind wandering. And you might reasonably ask, how is it that I became interested in mind wandering and meta-awareness? And the answer is Dan Wegner. And this is not a stretch. This is true story. About, almost 20 years ago, Jonathan Cohen and I organized a meeting on consciousness, and that produced a book called Scientific Approaches to Consciousness, and of course also a series of talks, because meetings have talks. And in both the talk and also in the chapter, Dan gave a talk, and he gave a talk on what I thought was this absolutely fascinating topic of, you can't really read this, but it's why the mind wanders. So it never even occurred to me to think about mind wandering or think about mind wandering as a tractable topic until Dan gave his talk, and it just preoccupied, my mind kept wandering, thinking about mind wandering. It was absolutely fascinating. Dan introduced this really intriguing idea that the mind wanders in the very effort to avoid mind wandering, which seemed to be absolutely fascinating. But there's more. He also, in this, talked about his ironic monitor, and he had this one line that really, really obsessed me, which was, he said, the monitor searches for failures of control by examining preconscious mental contents. And this made great sense to me, and there was certainly a lot of evidence that the monitor is sort of searching outside of consciousness for the contents that it's looking for. But it seemed to me quite plausible that it might not just be searching preconsciousness. Couldn't the monitor also be searching consciousness itself? Is it possible that it might not just be limited to preconsciousness? Could we also need a monitor to track the contents of conscious contents? And is it possible that we could mind wander without realizing that we were doing it? And this prospect that we might need a monitor that searches more than just preconsciousness, that we might need to actually know about the contents of consciousness itself, absolutely engaged me. And I found myself sort of stuck on a particular example and one of the things about this example is it's probably more compelling than any of the data we've ever collected since. But I think it really hits home the point. And that's, consider the case of mind wandering while reading. Most people have had the experience of suddenly realizing that their eyes have continued to move across their page, but their mind has been fundamentally elsewhere. Is this an experience that people are familiar with? If you look around, you'll see sort of a sheepish grin on many people's face, which is sort of the welcome to my world experience. Now, there's an interesting thing about mind wandering while reading, which differentiates it from other kinds of mind wandering. So right now, many of you are probably mind wandering because you have more interesting things to think about. But you can't just say, Schooler, would you please stop talking? I'm thinking about something right now, right? You can't stop the environment in order to think about whatever it is you want to think about. But reading is different. When you're reading, if you want to mind wander, just stop reading. There's no point to continue reading if you want to mind wander, right? It's absolutely counterproductive. But nevertheless, we do it. And so the question is, why do we routinely mind wander while reading when that is, and everybody knows you can't, read and think about something completely unrelated. This is sort of core knowledge to most people. The question is, why do we do it? And the answer that I think, and that I'll try to persuade you today, is that we do it because we've lost track of the contents of our own thought. That we've literally don't realize that we're mind wandering, even though that's what is up front and center in our own minds. So as a result of Dan's inspiration of thinking about mind wandering and thinking about what it is that the monitor is monitoring, set me off on a very fruitful, practically sort of career of research. I should also say that this book came out in '97, and I was thinking about these ideas, but never really got off. And then I went on a sabbatical at UVA, and I talked about these ideas with Dan then and also with Tim Wilson, and that really sort of solidified my conviction that this was something worth pursuing. Okay, so let me introduce you to sort of one of the primary paradigms that we've used to get at this issue. And it's basically using two different paradigms that both have been used frequently, but they weren't really used in conjunction. And so consider the situation of mind wandering while reading. So we have people reading, and then we ask them to press a button every time they notice themselves mind wandering, right? This would be a classic self-report paradigm, and this would be not unlike the way that Dan's done it with unwanted thoughts, where they press a button every time they notice themselves having an unwanted thought. Now, if you think about that situation, if you've just pressed a button saying that you were mind wandering, what does that mean? That means you were meta-aware. That means you were aware of the contents. You noticed that your mind was wandering at that particular time. But what we did was to add a second way of measuring performance. We would use experiential or thought sampling. So we'd probe people. Here they are in a task. They're supposed to press a button every time they notice themselves mind wandering. But in addition, we probe them at random times and go, just now, was your mind wandering? And so the question is, can we catch people mind wandering before they've noticed it themselves? And by using these two techniques, the self-caught and the probe-caught, we can look at the relationship between mind wandering that's reached meta-awareness when they press the button themselves and mind wandering that has eluded meta-awareness, which is when we use when we catch them with the probe. So what we find, interestingly, is that these two different ways, you might think these are just two different measures of self-report. You might think that these would be one and the same. But one of the really interesting things we've discovered with this line of research is that the probe-caught and the self-caught measures actually diverge in very systematic ways, consistent with the notion that one involves mind wandering that's reached meta-awareness and the other that hasn't. So one of the places that we've looked at was mind wandering while reading. Now, you might think, with all this research on reading comprehension, and with everybody having had the ubiquitous experience of mind wandering while reading, that somebody would have looked at whether or not mind wandering undermines reading comprehension performance. But interestingly, when we first did this research, no one had actually looked at that question. So we basically ran a study in which we had people read War and Peace. And one of our discoveries is that people mind wander a lot when they're reading War and Peace. And we had two different conditions. In one condition, they pressed the button every time they noticed themselves mind wandering, or sorry, these were simultaneous instructions. They were to press a button every time they noticed themselves mind wandering, and then we also intermittently probed them. And what we found is that those there was a positive correlation, a negative correlation. The more often that they were caught mind wandering, no, so this is positive correlation. Correlations, they get confusing. The more often they caught themselves, I'll get it right this time, I promise. The more often we caught them mind wandering, the poorer their performance. So I guess that is a negative correlation. This will teach me. I usually just show you the actual numbers, but this time I thought I would just use words, but that obviously didn't work. So this is very interesting, right? Mind wandering here is negatively associated with reading comprehension, as you might expect. We also found that probe-caught episodes are increased by alcohol. So when people consume alcohol, it markedly increases the likelihood that we'll catch them mind wandering. And we found that it is increased by craving. When people are craving for cigarettes, they're much more likely during this reading paradigm to be caught mind wandering by the probes. We also find, in contrast, that self-caught mind wandering episodes have a different signature. In contrast to probe-caught mind wandering, self-caught mind wandering tends not to be correlated with reading comprehension. And you might ask, why would you expect this difference? Well, if you think about it, if you catch yourself mind wandering yourself, you're able to engage in repair. You're basically sort of metacognitively on top of it. But if you haven't caught yourself, then you're going on and you're not able to comprehend the information. So it kind of makes sense that self-caught mind wandering would not be as problematic. We also find that self-caught episodes are decreased by alcohol. So the more alcohol that people consume, the less likely they are to notice themselves mind-wandering, while at the very same time, the more likely they are to be caught mind-wandering. So you can see this, you can sort of see why alcohol would be so problematic in situations like with driving. You, on the one hand, are more likely to lapse, and on the second hand, you're less likely to realize that you're so vulnerable. And we find the same thing with craving, that craving reduces people's likelihood of noticing themselves mind-wandering. Recently, we've found some other differences. We find that when people think about themselves, just having them describe themselves, that they're more likely to self-catch mind-wandering. Basically, the idea is that once you activate thoughts about the self, you increase your meta-awareness. And very recently, this is very preliminary data, we had people mind-wandering, and then afterwards, they were engaging in a task, and then we'd probe them, or they'd self-catch, and we'd ask them about the contents of their mind-wandering, whether they're thinking in images or whether they were thinking in words. And what we found is that when people self-catch, the mind-wandering contents are more likely to be verbal, whereas when they're probe-catch, there's a more likely to be visual. And so this is sort of consistent with the idea that verbal language may be associated with self-awareness, and it may be that part of the process by which people come to notice themselves mind-wandering is associated with linguistic processes. That's one way which we've assessed meta-awareness of mind-wandering. We've also used another way which you might think, you might really be suspicious that this would be effective at all. We just do experience sampling, but then afterwards we ask them, when they're caught mind-wandering, did you realize that you were mind-wandering? So this is kind of this weird retrospective judgment. You might think they wouldn't be very reliable at that, but we find very consistent differences between mind-wandering episodes that people classify as having been associated with meta-awareness and those that were not, that are consistent with those classifications. So relative to mind-wandering episodes classified as aware, unaware mind-wandering is more associated with comprehension deficits, much like the probe-caught one. So that's consistent. We have sort of triangulation with a different paradigm. More associated with a failure to detect gibberish. So this is kind of a cute paradigm. We have people reading text, and periodically the text becomes gibberish. It's the right words in the wrong place. So we basically switch the nouns around, and they're advancing the text as if they think they are understanding what they're reading. Then we probe them, and we examine whether or not they're mind-wandering as a function of how long it's been going on that they've been missing the gibberish. And what we find is that typically people catch the gibberish right away. But sometimes they'll go on for sentences without noticing that it's gibberish. And if you probe them at that time and go, OK, just now, were you mind-wandering? The answer is typically yes. And did you know that you were mind-wandering? No. So these long lapses where people are advancing the text thinking they're understanding what they're reading when it makes absolutely no sense at all is typically associated with the unaware mind-wandering episodes. We've also, you might think that this would not generalize to actual differences in brain activation. But we did a study in which we had people engaging in a task known as the SART task, which is a really cruel task. You have people pressing a button every time they see a number except the number 3, and they have to withhold a response when it's the number 3. And the number 3 is very rare, so they're just like doing this tedious task for a very long time. And what happens typically is that they mind-wander, and of course when they mind-wander they'll make errors when the item appears. Anyhow, we use this task, we probed them in the scanner, and we asked them, just now was your mind wandering? And then what we did is to look at the activation prior to the report. So we can compare on-task reports to off-task reports. And then if they said that they were off-task, We also asked them, were you aware of whether or not you were mind-wandering or not? And what we basically found is that the difference between, you can see it right here, we found activation in both areas of the default network and, interestingly, the executive network. Greater activation when people were off task than when they were on. And the default network makes a lot of sense given what we know about the activation of it during idle periods. The executive network is a bit more confusing here, but it makes sense when you consider that this is a very non-demanding task, whereas when people are mind-wandering, they're actually thinking about their goals and future plans and so on. In any case, the interesting thing is that when we compare the difference, the top set here pattern is when people were unaware of mind-wandering. The bottom panels when they were aware. The difference between on-task and off-task is markedly greater when people were unaware of the fact that they were mind-wandering, suggesting that this rather seemingly sort of rough-hewn classification really results in rather dramatic patterns of differences in brain activation. Okay, I've gone long enough without talking about Dan, so let me bring it back to Dan. Again, you might ask the question, not only is it possible for people to mind wander without realizing that they're mind wandering, but also is it possible to have an unwanted thought without realizing that you're having an unwanted thought? And so in this study, we basically used a paradigm that Dan pioneered in which people were asked to recall a past romantic relationship and then to not think about that relationship. And then what we did is we had various different conditions. In one condition, they were reading, and in another condition, they were silent. And then all subjects were asked to press a button each time they thought about their previous partner. And then in addition, half of the subjects were probed every 40 seconds and asked if they were thinking about the relationship. So the question is, can we catch people having these unwanted thoughts before they notice it themselves? So the paradigm works as follows. They're reading along in 1994, the United States Federal Highway Association funded a consortium. They're reading along, yada, 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 yada. Then suddenly the screen, just now were you thinking about your previous relationship partner? And so the question is, and mind you, these people are supposed to be telling us when they were thinking about it. So it's an interesting question in and of itself. Are people having these thoughts without realizing it? And what we found was that these are, first off, the number of self-reported unwanted thoughts. We found that, in general, people caught themselves, consistent with Dan's findings, that people caught themselves having these unwanted thoughts quite substantially. They caught themselves more in the self-report condition than self-report and probe, because basically we were catching them, so that prevented them from catching themselves. The difference between the quiet and the reading is not, don't make any much of that, because they were reading for a longer period of time than they were quiet. Now, the interesting thing is the probe caught measures. What we found is that 20% of the time, here they're in a reading task. They're supposed to not be thinking about these partners, and they're supposed to be telling us every time that they are, right? So they really shouldn't be thinking about their partners at all. Nevertheless, 20% of the time, we're catching these people thinking about their partners, even though that's exactly what they're trying not to be doing, and even though they haven't told us about this. If we then look at the relationship between people's mind-wandering, between the unwanted thoughts, and there's a lot of data here, I just want you to focus on these two things here. Basically what we find, it's the unnoticed ones, the probe-caught mind-wandering, right here, which is correlated with reading comprehension. The ones that they notice themselves are not. The last piece of data I want to show you from this study is simply the relationship between the form of catching and the nature of the romantic relationship. In their paper, Dan distinguished between hot flames and cold flames. A hot flame is somebody who wishes that they were still in the relationship, and a cold flame is basically, they're the one who dumped the person. And so you can ask the question, what is the relationship between these two different kinds of ways of catching unwanted thoughts and the nature of the relationship? And here we go, correlations. Basically, what we found is that the correlation to be with the ex-partner, the more they wanted to be with the ex-partner, the more likely we were to catch them thinking about it, and it wasn't significant, but going in the opposite direction, the less likely they were to notice it themselves. So basically what seems to be going on here is that these individuals who want to be in the relationship, they're not noticing they're not noticing it themselves, but we're catching them having the thoughts. So one way of thinking about this is that individuals, that the self-caught, probe-caught distinction may give us another way of thinking about, I hate to use this term, but something akin to repression. When people are don't want to think about something, it may not be that the thought comes to mind. In fact, these people who want to be in the relationship are thinking about the people quite a lot. They're just not acknowledging that fact to themselves. So, people regularly fail to notice unwanted thoughts. They unnoticed unwanted thoughts are especially disruptive to reading comprehension, and individuals may be motivated to avoid noticing thoughts. That is, individuals who still are in the relationship are not noticing the thoughts themselves, and therefore we're more likely to catch them having these thoughts. This provides sort of an alternative way of thinking about repression, and it suggests that what may happen in sort of this sort of motivated process is not that the thoughts don't reach consciousness, but that we fail to acknowledge those thoughts to ourselves. Okay, so in conclusion, it seems I just can't stop thinking about Wegner's ideas. And as a consequence, I've learned that we often don't realize that we are mind-wandering, that there are qualitative differences between mind-wandering episodes that occur with versus without meta-awareness, and we often don't realize we are engaging in unwanted thoughts. And then lastly, more speculatively, repression-like processes may prevent us from noticing undesirable thoughts that are occurring in consciousness. I might add that I could go on and talk about other lines of research that have also been influenced by thinking about Dan's ideas. In thinking about recovered memories, I've speculated that one of the things that may happen is that when people have these recovered memories, they're basically getting the ironic rebound effect that Dan has found in much of his research. Dan was really a role model to me in illustrating how it's possible to tackle a topic as challenging as thinking about free will and look at it in scientifically attractable ways. And one thing that I didn't get a chance to talk about is creative incubation. One of the really intriguing ideas about this automatic monitor is that it doesn't necessarily have to exclusively be looking for unwanted thoughts. It could also be looking for other kinds of thoughts, such as creative ideas. It makes a lot of sense that we might set that monitor out to look for a solution to a problem that has not been solved. And this is one really, I think, intriguing way of thinking about the value of incubation intervals. I think that all of us could go on and on talking about the amazing sort of influence that Dan has had on us. It's unquestionable to me that, Dan, that you've profoundly influenced the course of my research in ways that I will be forever grateful, and I want to thank you for that.